fifth grade. This video is for Tuesday, April 14th. I just want to say thank you to those of you that have finished up your state project and have turned it in. I look forward to reading those, and I hope that you enjoyed learning a lot of interesting information about your state. For any of you that haven't finished and turned them in yet, I'd like you to do that as soon as possible, please. So today we're going to begin a new chapter, chapter 13, the Civil War. But before we do that, I just want to point out one thing from chapter 12, which we're not going to cover completely, but you're always welcome to go back and read that chapter. Chapter 12 is titled Our Nation Grows, and this talks about how our nation became larger after the War for Independence. And so if you look on page 184 and 185, you'll see a map of the United States. After the War for Independence, our country only went as far west as the Mississippi River. But one thing that helped our country increase in size quite a bit was the Louisiana Purchase. And if you flip over just a few pages to page 189, you can follow along with me. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. But the Louisiana Purchase was done by our third president, President Thomas Jefferson, and he had wanted to purchase the city of New Orleans. The city of New Orleans was owned by the French, and he offered $2 million for that city because it was such a great seaport. But the French government decided that they would sell not only New Orleans, but the whole Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. And that's quite a bit of money, but when you look at the size of the land that we were able to acquire, it was quite a deal. And so President Jefferson jumped on that deal, bought that land from the French for $15 million. And it later provided all or part of the land for 15 new states. And so he chose two men, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Captain William Clark, to go and explore this new territory, this new land that the United States had acquired. And so they set out, they traveled through that whole territory. They drew maps, they drew pictures of plants and animals that they saw along the way. But they also had difficulty communicating with Indian tribes that they met. So they met a trapper whose wife was an Indian. Her name was Sacagawea, and they agreed to travel with Lewis and Clark, and then she was able to translate for them. And so as they traveled and came back, they reported to President Jefferson about what they saw. And this really created a lot of excitement in people living on the East Coast to travel west. And so pioneers began to come and settle in that territory. So if you want to go back and read more of chapter 12, you're more than welcome to. So as our country grew, we also began to have some problems. There was an issue that had been going on for quite some time that had caused a lot of division in our country, and that issue was slavery. Slavery had existed in all of the states at one point, but had died out in the northern states. In the northern states, they had small farms, factories, and no slaves. There wasn't need for slaves because there were not large farms. They were family-owned farms for the most part. And then in the factories, people were paid to do the work that the factories were asking them to do. But in the South, they had large farms called plantations where they grew two main crops, cotton and tobacco. They had very few factories, and they had slaves to work on those plantations to do the work. And so as the years went on, and more states were being added and land was being added to our country, there was always the question of, would these new states be slave states or would they be free states? Would they be states where slavery was not allowed or where slavery was allowed? And so there was growing tension in our country about that issue at this time. So the Civil War is the title of our chapter. And if we were all together, I would ask you if you knew what that meant. but I hope you know, or you're thinking about it. So a civil war is different from another kind of war, because a civil war is where people within the same country are fighting against each other. In other types of war, you're usually fighting an enemy from without. Another country might be attacking your country, you're trying to defend it. But in a civil war, it's people from the same country fighting against each other. All war is sad and all war is terrible, but I think civil wars are particularly sad because people that are the citizens of the same country are fighting against each other. And so as you're going to read on page 205 and 206, you'll read about the differences between the North and the South before the war. And you're going to read about an invention that really changed things in the South. And that invention was made by a man named Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney came up with something called the cotton gin. He invented this machine. And gin is just short for engine. Cotton was a very profitable crop in the South, but it wasn't grown a lot until Eli Whitney's invention. Because when we think of cotton, we usually think of nice, fluffy, white cotton balls, right? Well, that's not how cotton grows. It grows on a plant, and when you pick it off the plant, you don't just get the nice, fluffy, white cotton. You get other things with it. You get stems, you get leaves. You don't get just the lint, as it's called, that you want from the cotton. And so it was very time-consuming. It had to be hand-picked. And then after it was picked, it had to be separated from the parts that you didn't want. The lint that you actually wanted separated from the stems and the leaves and all of that. Well, when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, it made it very easy to separate the lint, the part of the cotton that was actually usable, from the other parts, the stems and the leaves and things. And so that really changed things in the South, and more plantation owners began to plant cotton. And because of that, they needed more and more workers for their plantations, so that increased slavery in the South. And that brought up the question again of, how can we call our country a free country when many of the people living in our country were not free? Remember, in the Declaration of Independence, it was written that all men are created equal and they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were not being afforded to the slaves in the South. And so people in the North were putting pressure on Southern slave owners to free their slaves, to not have them working on their plantations. But the plantation owners were saying, how can we continue to earn our livelihood if we don't have workers for our plantation? So it was a difficult situation that did not have a simple answer. And this reminded me of a verse in the Bible in Acts chapter 10, verse 34. God had called Peter to go and talk to a man named Cornelius. And Peter, remember, was a Jew, but he was a believer in Jesus, but he had lived his life as a Jew, been raised as a Jew. And God was showing Peter that Jesus had come to die for everyone. It was not just for the Jews, but it was also for the Gentiles. And this man Cornelius was a Gentile, and God called Peter to go to Cornelius and to explain the gospel to him. And Peter realized what God was asking him to do, and that he needed to share the gospel with Cornelius and his family. And in verse 34 it says, "So Peter opened his mouth and said, 'Truly I understand that God shows no partiality.'" God does not show favoritism or partiality. God loves everyone the same. He does not love us based on the color of our skin or our hair or our eyes or what country we live in. God loves everyone. And so we see that during the Civil War, there was this tension, there was this difficulty of why some of the people living in our country were not given the same rights and freedoms as others living in the country. And so I'd like you to go ahead and read pages 205 and 206 and then watch the video, Eli Whitney and the Cotton Gin.